The CNN studio lights blazed as tension filled the air. Jason Chaffetz, the former Utah Congressman turned Fox News contributor, sat across from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, his signature smirk already forming. He thought he had the perfect trap set. After all, this was the man who had grilled Hillary Clinton for hours, who had made careers crumble with his congressional investigations. But what happened in the next 30 seconds would leave Chaffetz speechless and create the most viral political moment of the week. Congressman Chaffetz just tried something that backfired spectacularly, the clip would later read on Twitter. What Jasmine Crockett said next ended the entire segment and left him with absolutely no comeback. This wasn't just another political debate. This was the moment when a rising Democratic star showed exactly why underestimating her is a mistake that even seasoned politicians like Chaffetz shouldn't make. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and make sure to hit that subscribe button, because moments like this don't happen every day, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The stage was set for what Chaffetz thought would be an easy win. He was wrong. Dead wrong. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who was sitting across from each other that night on CNN's prime-time show. At 57, Jason Chaffetz had built his entire post-congressional career on one thing: being the guy who asks the tough questions. During his time in Congress from 2009 to 2017, he was the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, the man who turned congressional hearings into must-see TV drama. He was the one grilling Secret Service directors, IRS commissioners, and yes, Hillary Clinton during the Benghazi investigations. After leaving Congress, Chaffetz landed a cushy spot at Fox News, where he became a regular contributor, appearing on shows like Fox and Friends and Hannity. His brand was simple: the no-nonsense conservative who could make Democrats squirm with his rapid-fire questioning style. He wrote books, gave speeches, and built a media empire around being the guy who held Washington accountable. But here's what made Chaffetz dangerous in debates. He was a master of the gotcha moment. He would come prepared with statistics, old quotes, and carefully crafted questions designed to put his opponents in impossible positions. He wasn't just debating, he was prosecuting, and he rarely lost. Across from him sat 43-year-old Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas, and if Chaffetz had done his homework, he would have known he was walking into a buzzsaw. Crockett wasn't your typical freshman congresswoman. Before coming to Washington in 2023, she was a civil rights attorney in Dallas, the kind who took on police departments and won. She had a law degree from the University of Houston Law Center and had spent years in courtrooms going toe-to-toe with prosecutors and judges. This wasn't someone who got rattled easily. But what made Crockett truly dangerous was her combination of legal training and social media savvy. She understood that in 2024 politics, the real battle wasn't just won in the hearing room, it was won in the clips that went viral afterward. She knew how to deliver a line that would get shared millions of times. Since taking office, Crockett had already made waves. She was the one who called out Republicans for their fake outrage during committee hearings. She was the one who went viral for her pointed questions during the Trump investigations. And she was building a reputation as someone who didn't back down from a fight, no matter how experienced her opponent was. This wasn't just two politicians having a discussion. This was a clash of two different approaches to power in Washington. Chaffetz represented the old guard, the belief that experience in the system, knowledge of parliamentary procedure, and years of playing political games would always win out. He was the establishment, even as a conservative, because he knew how the game was played. Crockett represented something different, a new generation of politicians who understood that the rules had changed. Social media had democratized political communication. A perfectly timed response could reach more people than a 10-minute floor speech. And authenticity often mattered more than credentials. The topic they were debating made the stakes even higher. They were discussing the ongoing investigations into various Trump administration officials, a subject where both parties had deeply entrenched positions. Chaffetz, as a former oversight chairman, was defending the Republican position that Democrats were engaging in political witch hunts. Crockett, as a current member of the House, was arguing that accountability was exactly what oversight was supposed to provide. But beneath the policy debate was a bigger question. Was the old way of doing politics, Chaffetz's way, still effective? Or had politicians like Crockett figured out a new playbook that could neutralize traditional political tactics? What made this confrontation so perfect was that Chaffetz thought he had the ideal setup. He had been watching Crockett's committee performances, studying her style, and he was convinced he had found her weakness. She was passionate, sometimes fiery, and Chaffetz believed he could use that against her. His plan was classic Chaffetz: ask a series of detailed procedural questions about oversight rules, force her into a defensive position, and then spring his trap with a question about her own committee conduct. It was the same playbook he had used successfully for years. He had even tested some of his lines on Fox News the week before, getting nods of approval from hosts who assured him that Crockett would be out of her league against someone with his experience. But Chaffetz made one crucial mistake. He was preparing to fight the last war. He was getting ready for the kind of debate that worked in 2015, not the kind that happened in 2024. And Jasmine Crockett was about to show him exactly what that meant. The cameras were rolling, the lights were hot, and both politicians were ready to make their case to the American people. Chaffetz had his notes, his practiced expressions, and his years of experience. Crockett had something else entirely. The debate began exactly as Chaffetz had planned. CNN host Anderson Cooper introduced both guests, and Chaffetz immediately took control of the conversation with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. "Anderson, what we're seeing from House Democrats right now is exactly the kind of partisan overreach that Americans are tired of," Chaffetz began, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority that had made him a Fox News favorite. "And Congresswoman Crockett, frankly, has been one of the worst offenders." The camera cut to Crockett, who sat calmly, her hands folded, listening with the kind of attention that should have been Chaffetz's first warning sign. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't preparing an emotional response. She was listening like a lawyer listens to opposing counsel, waiting for the mistake. But Chaffetz was just getting started. "Let me ask you something specific, Congresswoman," he continued, pulling out his familiar rapid-fire questioning style. "In your committee hearings over the past 6 months, how many Republican witnesses have you called? How many have you actually allowed to present their full testimony without interruption?" It was a classic Chaffetz move. Ask for specific numbers that most politicians wouldn't have memorized, creating an immediate credibility gap. But Crockett's response was immediate and precise. "Congressman Chaffetz, in the Oversight Committee alone, we've had 12 Republican witnesses in the past 6 months, 7 of whom were given unlimited time for their opening statements. Would you like me to name them?" The studio went quiet for just a moment. Chaffetz's eyebrows raised slightly. This wasn't the response he expected. Most politicians would have given a vague answer about working in a bipartisan way. Crockett had just called his bluff with specific numbers. But Chaffetz was a veteran. He pivoted quickly. "That's interesting, because from what I've seen of your committee performances, Congresswoman, you seem more interested in creating viral moments than actually conducting oversight," Chaffetz said, his tone becoming more pointed. "Twitter clips and TikTok videos aren't the same thing as serious legislative work." This was the attack Chaffetz thought would land. He was essentially calling her a social media politician, someone who cared more about likes and shares than actual governance. It was the kind of generational critique that had worked for him before against younger politicians. Crockett's response was measured, but you could see something shift in her posture. She leaned forward slightly, her voice remaining calm but gaining an edge. "Congressman, that's fascinating coming from someone who left Congress to become a TV pundit," she said. "But since you brought up oversight, let's talk about your record. During your time as oversight chairman, how many Trump administration officials did you actually hold accountable? How many subpoenas did you issue to investigate potential corruption?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Chaffetz's face tightened slightly, but he pressed forward. "Congresswoman, I conducted oversight based on evidence, not political theater," he replied. "Unlike what we're seeing now, where Democrats are weaponizing congressional committees for partisan gain." This was where Chaffetz thought he would spring his ultimate trap. He had researched Crockett's committee questioning style and believed he had found inconsistencies in how she applied parliamentary procedure. "Let me ask you about committee rules, since you seem so confident about your oversight role," Chaffetz said, consulting his notes with theatrical precision. "According to House rules, specifically Rule 11, Clause 2J1, Committee chairs are required to provide how much advance notice for witness testimony, and have you been following that rule in your recent hearings? It was a classic gotcha question, asking for a specific rule citation that most people wouldn't have memorized, designed to make Crockett look unprepared or uninformed about basic congressional procedure. But instead of fumbling or deflecting, Crockett did something unexpected. She smiled. "Congressman, are you referring to the 72-hour rule for witness testimony, or are you thinking of the 48-hour rule for document submission?" she asked. "Because if you're going to quiz me on House rules, you should probably make sure you're citing them correctly first." The color drained slightly from Chaffetz's face. He had misremembered the specific rule number, and Crockett had not only caught it but corrected him publicly. Worse, she had done it with the kind of calm precision that made it clear this wasn't luck. She actually knew the rules better than he did. Chaffetz, now clearly frustrated, abandoned his careful script and went for a more direct attack. "Congresswoman, let's be honest about what this is really about," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You're a freshman member of Congress who's been in office for barely 2 years, and you're trying to lecture people who have been doing this work for decades. The American people can see through this kind of grandstanding. It was a mistake, a big one." Chaffetz had just made this personal, and worse, he had made it about experience versus newcomer status. For a man who had built his career on being the outsider taking on the Washington establishment, it was a particularly tone-deaf attack. Crockett's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. "Congressman, you're absolutely right that I'm newer to Congress than you were," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But I'm still here, and you're not. So maybe the American people did see through something, just not what you think." The audience in the CNN studio was dead silent. Even Anderson Cooper looked slightly stunned by the directness of the response. But Chaffetz wasn't done. His face was flushed now, and he was clearly off his game plan. "That's exactly the kind of response I'm talking about," Chaffetz said, his voice now carrying a tone of condescension that was palpable through the television screen. "Smart aleck comments instead of substantive policy discussion. This is why serious people in Washington have a hard time taking your committee work seriously." He paused, thinking he was about to deliver his knockout punch. "Congresswoman Crockett, you've been talking about accountability and oversight, but let me ask you this. How do you explain your own committee conduct? How do you justify some of the questioning tactics you've used? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're more interested in getting clips for social media than actually getting answers for the American people." It was meant to be his big moment, the experienced Washington hand putting the upstart freshman in her place with a combination of procedural knowledge and moral authority. Instead, it was about to become the setup for one of the most devastating political responses in recent memory. Crockett looked at him for a moment, and everyone watching could sense that something had shifted. The polite back and forth was over. The legal training was about to show up in full force. "Congressman Chaffetz," she began, her voice dropping to a tone that anyone who had ever been cross-examined by a skilled attorney would recognize immediately. The trap that Chaffetz thought he had set was about to spring, but not on the person he expected. The CNN studio had that electric feeling that veteran producers recognize immediately, the moment when live television becomes unforgettable television. Anderson Cooper was leaning forward slightly, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be the clip that defined this segment. Jasmine Crockett looked directly at Jason Chaffetz, and her voice carried the kind of controlled intensity that comes from years of courtroom experience. "Congressman Chaffetz, since you want to talk about committee conduct and getting answers for the American people, let me ask you something," she began, her tone measured but unmistakably sharp. "During your time as oversight chairman, when you had the power to investigate potential corruption in real time, where were you?" Chaffetz opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. "Where were you when the Trump administration was refusing to comply with congressional subpoenas? Where were you when we needed someone to ask tough questions about conflicts of interest? Where were you when the American people needed a real watchdog?" The attack was surgical in its precision. Every word was calculated for maximum impact, delivered with the kind of clarity that made it impossible to misunderstand. "You know where you were, Congressman. You were on Fox News, getting paid to defend the very administration you should have been investigating." Chaffetz's face was now visibly red, and he was clearly struggling to regain control of the conversation. "Congresswoman, that is completely unfair and you know it. I served with distinction and integrity." "Did you?" Crockett interrupted, and the interruption itself was like a verbal slap. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you abandoned your duty to the American people the moment it became politically inconvenient." She paused, letting that sink in, before continuing. "You want to talk about social media clips and political theater? You literally left Congress to become a television personality. You traded your gavel for a makeup artist and a teleprompter." Anderson Cooper was trying to maintain his professional composure, but even he looked like he was watching a verbal murder in real time. Chaffetz, now completely off his script and visibly flustered, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Congresswoman, I think the American people can see what kind of politician you are from this display," he said, his voice shaking slightly with anger. "This is exactly why Congress has lost the respect of the American people, because of grandstanding politicians like you who care more about scoring points than solving problems." It was meant to be his moral high ground moment, positioning himself as the reasonable adult in the room, above the partisan fray. Instead, he had just given Jasmine Crockett the perfect setup for what would become one of the most quoted political lines of the year. Crockett looked at him with the kind of expression that experienced trial lawyers wear when they're about to deliver the line that wins the case. "Congressman Chaffetz," she said, her voice now carrying just the right combination of authority and dismissal. "Respectfully, you don't get to lecture anyone about serving the American people." She paused for just a beat. The perfect dramatic timing that would make the clip infinitely shareable. "You quit." Those two words landed like a bomb in the CNN studio. The silence that followed was deafening. "You quit," she repeated, the words now carrying even more weight. "You didn't lose an election. You didn't get voted out by the people. You quit. You abandoned your post, walked away from your responsibility, and then got a job criticizing the people who stayed to do the work you couldn't finish." Chaffetz's mouth was literally hanging open. For perhaps the first time in his entire political career, he had no response. The man who had built his reputation on always having the perfect comeback, the devastating follow-up question, the moral authority of the oversight chairman, was sitting there in complete silence. "So no," Crockett continued, her voice now rising with the confidence of someone who knew she had just delivered a knockout punch. "You don't get to question my commitment to this job. You don't get to lecture me about accountability. And you certainly don't get to criticize my conduct as a member of Congress." She leaned back in her chair, her point made with surgical precision. "Because at the end of the day, Congressman, I'm still here doing the job, and you're here getting paid to talk about it on TV." Anderson Cooper looked back and forth between his two guests, clearly recognizing that something historic had just happened on his show. The camera stayed on Chaffetz's face for what felt like an eternity in television time, maybe 3 seconds. But it was long enough to capture the exact moment when a political career gets redefined. Chaffetz finally found his voice, but it was weak and defensive in a way that viewers had never heard from him before. "Congresswoman, I left Congress for personal reasons, family reasons that I think anyone can understand," he stammered. It was the wrong response. Weak, defensive, and worst of all, it sounded like an excuse. Crockett didn't even need to respond. She just looked at him with the kind of expression that said, "Really? That's what you're going with?" The silence stretched for another moment before Anderson Cooper, recognizing that this segment had reached its natural conclusion, stepped in. "We're going to have to leave it there," Cooper said, his voice carrying just a hint of amazement at what he had just witnessed. "Congressman Chaffetz, Congresswoman Crockett, thank you both for joining us tonight." But everyone watching knew that this wasn't really a both sides moment. One person had walked into that studio as a respected political commentator, and the other had walked out as a viral sensation who had just redefined what it meant to win a political debate. As the cameras pulled back for the final shot, the contrast was stark. Crockett sat calmly, completely composed, looking like someone who had just finished a particularly easy cross-examination. Chaffetz looked like someone who had just been hit by a truck he never saw coming. The handshake at the end was perfunctory, but even that became part of the story. Chaffetz's grip was weak, his smile forced. Crockett's was firm and confident. the handshake of someone who knew they had just changed the game. As they removed their microphones and the cameras stopped rolling, you could see Chaffetz immediately reaching for his phone, probably to start damage control with his Fox News producers. Crockett, meanwhile, looked like someone who was already thinking about her next committee hearing. The segment was over, but the real show was just beginning. Because in the age of social media, the most important part of any political confrontation isn't what happens during the debate. It's what happens after. Before Anderson Cooper had even finished his closing remarks, the internet was already exploding. CNN's social media team, recognizing political gold when they saw it, had the clip posted to Twitter within 90 seconds of the segment ending. The tweet was simple: "You quit." At Representative Jasmine Crockett to former Representative Jason Chaffetz on at AC360 within 5 minutes. That tweet had over 10,000 retweets. Within an hour, it had over 100,000. By the end of the night, "You quit" was trending nationally on Twitter, and the clip had been viewed over 2 million times across all platforms. But the real viral moment wasn't just the line itself. It was the way Crockett had delivered it. The pause before she spoke. The calm, almost conversational tone. The way she had looked directly at Chaffetz as she said it. It was the kind of perfect political theater that social media was designed to amplify. Within hours, "You quit" had become the foundation for an entire meme ecosystem. Twitter users were applying the phrase to everything from sports to relationships to work situations. When your group project partner criticizes your work but they drop the class, you quit. When your ex tries to give you relationship advice, you quit. When someone who rage quit a video game tries to backseat game, you quit. But the political memes were even more savage. Conservative Twitter users found themselves in the impossible position of trying to defend Chaffetz without acknowledging that Crockett's point was essentially accurate. He had, in fact, quit Congress. One particularly viral meme showed a photo of Chaffetz during his congressional days next to a photo of him on Fox News with the caption, "From I'll hold them accountable to let me tell you what they should be doing, the Jason Chaffetz story." Another showed Crockett's calm expression during the "you quit" moment with the caption, "When someone tries to question your work ethic, but they literally quit their job." The response from Washington insiders was swift and telling. Democratic politicians immediately began sharing the clip, recognizing that Crockett had just provided them with a perfect template for dealing with Republican criticism. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office released a statement saying, "Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated exactly the kind of principled leadership the American people deserve from their elected officials." But it was the response from progressive firebrands that really showed how significant this moment was. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is how you handle bad faith attacks. Take notes." Even more telling was the response from moderate Democrats who don't usually engage in social media battles. Senator Joe Manchin, not exactly known for his confrontational style, retweeted the clip with the comment, "Sometimes the truth is simple." On the Republican side, the response was notably muted. Fox News, where Chaffetz was a regular contributor, initially didn't mention the segment at all in their morning shows. When they finally addressed it, it was with the kind of defensive spin that suggested they knew they were fighting an uphill battle. Jason Chaffetz served his country with distinction in Congress, Tucker Carlson said on his show the next night. The personal attacks from the left show how desperate they are to avoid talking about their own failures. But even that response felt weak. How do you defend someone against the charge that they quit when they did, in fact, quit? Other Republican politicians largely stayed silent, recognizing that defending Chaffetz would only draw more attention to the clip. The few who did comment focused on Crockett's tone or disrespect, classic deflection tactics that nobody really bought. Political commentators and media critics immediately recognized that something significant had happened. This wasn't just another cable news argument. It was a perfect example of how political communication had evolved in the social media age. What Jasmine Crockett did last night, wrote Washington Post media critic Margaret Sullivan, was demonstrate that the old rules of political debate don't apply anymore. Chaffetz came prepared for the kind of procedural gotcha politics that worked in 2015. Crockett showed up with 2024 rules. CNN's own political team published an analysis piece titled, How 2 words changed a political career, examining how Crockett had managed to completely neutralize Chaffetz's traditional advantages. Chaffetz had every advantage going into that segment, wrote CNN political analyst Chris Cillizza. He had more experience, more name recognition, and home field advantage as a frequent cable news guest. But Crockett had something more powerful, a simple, undeniable truth delivered at exactly the right moment. But beyond the immediate viral moment, political observers began to recognize that this confrontation represented something larger about the changing nature of American politics. For years, politicians like Chaffetz had built careers on a specific model: use congressional positions to build name recognition, then transition to lucrative media careers where they could criticize without accountability. It was a well-worn path that dozens of former politicians had followed. Crockett had just blown up that entire model with 2 words. What she did, explained George Washington University political scientist Sarah Binder, was make explicit something that voters have been feeling for years, that there's something fundamentally dishonest about people who quit governing so they can get paid to criticize governance. The implications for other former politicians turned media personalities were immediate and obvious. Suddenly, every TV appearance by a former congressman carried the risk that some current politician would hit them with their own version of "you quit." For his part, Chaffetz attempted a multi-platform response strategy that only seemed to make things worse. The next morning, he appeared on Fox and Friends to provide his side of the story. "What you saw last night was exactly the kind of personal attack politics that Americans are tired of," he said, looking notably less confident than usual. Instead of defending her record, Congresswoman Crockett chose to make it personal, but the host's question suggested that even his allies recognized he had been badly damaged. "How do you respond to critics who say she had a point about your decision to leave Congress?" asked Steve Doocy, in what was clearly a softball question designed to let Chaffetz explain himself. Chaffetz's answer was telling. "I left Congress for family reasons, and I think most Americans can understand that someone might want to spend more time with their family instead of dealing with the dysfunction in Washington." It was a reasonable explanation, but it completely missed the point of Crockett's attack. She hadn't criticized him for leaving Congress. She had criticized him for leaving Congress and then criticizing the people who stayed. As the day progressed, the social media response only got worse for Chaffetz. Users began digging up old clips of him criticizing other politicians, creating side-by-side videos that showed his attacks next to Crockett's "you quit" response. One particularly damaging compilation showed Chaffetz during his congressional days criticizing various Obama administration officials for lack of accountability, followed immediately by the CNN clip. The juxtaposition was devastating. Even worse for Chaffetz, comedy shows picked up the story. The Daily Show did an entire segment on politicians who quit and won't stop talking, featuring Chaffetz prominently. Saturday Night Live included a brief sketch in their Weekend Update segment about former politicians who don't know their former. For Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath was entirely different. Her congressional office reported that they received over 500 calls in the day after the CNN appearance, with the vast majority being supportive. More importantly for her political future, she began receiving invitations to appear on other shows. MSNBC booked her for a week-long series of appearances. The View invited her as a guest. Political podcasts that had never heard of her before were suddenly reaching out. "What Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated," said Democratic strategist James Carville, "is that she understands the modern media environment in a way that a lot of politicians still don't. She didn't just win that debate, she created a moment." But the impact went beyond just political circles. "You quit" began showing up in contexts that had nothing to do with politics. Sports commentators started using it when discussing athletes who had demanded trades. Business reporters used it when covering executives who left companies and then criticized their former employers. The phrase had become shorthand for a specific type of hypocrisy, the hypocrisy of abandoning responsibility and then criticizing those who remained responsible. Political consultants immediately began studying the Crockett response as a template for dealing with similar attacks. The elements were simple but powerful. Let your opponent overextend themselves. Identify the core hypocrisy in their position. Deliver your response with surgical precision and don't over-explain. Let the truth speak for itself. What she did was Politics 101, explained Republican strategist Mike Murphy. But she executed it perfectly, and in the social media age, perfect execution gets amplified in ways that weren't possible even 5 years ago. The beauty of Crockett's approach was that it didn't require extensive preparation or inside knowledge. It simply required the discipline to stay focused on the fundamental truth and the confidence to deliver it without apology. This made it a replicable strategy that other politicians could adapt to their own situations, creating a new standard for handling bad faith criticism in the modern media environment. For Jason Chaffetz, the long-term impact was immediately apparent. Within a week of the CNN appearance, his bookings on other networks dried up. Producers who had previously seen him as a reliable conservative voice began to worry that bringing him on would just create opportunities for Democratic guests to replay Crockett's attack. Even on Fox News, his appearances became less frequent and more carefully managed. Instead of the freewheeling political combat he had been known for, his segments became more scripted and focused on safer topics. The problem for Chaffetz, explained a Fox News insider who spoke on condition of anonymity, is that he can't really fight back without drawing more attention to the thing that hurt him in the first place. It's political quicksand. 6 months later, "You quit" had entered the political lexicon in a way that few phrases ever do. It became a standard response to criticism from former officials, used by politicians of both parties when facing attacks from people who had left public service. But more than that, it represented a shift in how political debates were conducted. The old model, where experience and procedural knowledge provided automatic advantages, had been replaced by something more direct and more democratic. What Jasmine Crockett figured out, wrote New York Times political columnist Maureen Dowd, is that in the age of social media, authenticity beats credentials every time. Voters don't want to hear about House Rule 11, Clause 2J1. They want to hear the truth, delivered clearly and without apology. The truth in this case was simple. You can't credibly criticize people for doing a job that you quit doing. And sometimes the simplest truths are the most powerful. As political operatives and media personalities studied the Chaffetz-Crockett exchange, certain lessons became clear about the new rules of political engagement in the social media age. First, preparation matters, but not in the way it used to. Chaffetz had prepared extensively, with notes and procedural knowledge and carefully planned attack lines. But Crockett's preparation was different. She had prepared to tell a simple truth in the most effective way possible. Second, authenticity trumps experience. Chaffetz had every traditional advantage: more years in politics, more media experience, more name recognition. But Crockett had something more valuable. She was genuinely doing the job he was criticizing others for doing. Third, the social media tail now wags the political dog. The real audience for political debates isn't the people watching live. It's the millions who will see the clips later. Politicians who understand this, like Crockett, structure their responses accordingly. This wasn't just a moment of political theater. It was a master class in how to stand up to bad faith criticism and defend your principles under pressure. Whether you're in politics, business, or just dealing with difficult people in your daily life, there are lessons here about the power of simple truth delivered with confidence. If you found this breakdown helpful and want to see more analysis of political moments that changed the game, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because in American politics today, everything can change with just 2 words, and you won't want to miss the next moment when it happens. The age of "you quit" politics has officially begun, and Jasmine Crockett just wrote the playbook.